Rachel had long since grown used to the quiet hum of the diner after dark, the way the neon sign flickered against the rain-streaked windows, the faint clatter of a fork being sorted into the silverware tray, and the smell of old coffee lingering in the air. At 28, she moved through her shift with a quiet rhythm, always courteous, always efficient, but rarely noticed. The little diner sat tucked into a tired corner of a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, where most customers paid in crumpled bills and loose change. And Rachel, with her name tag slightly askew and her sneakers worn thin, had become part of the wallpaper, steady, invisible, dependable. She lived alone in a modest studio apartment above a laundromat, where the walls were thin and the heat never quite reached the corners. She was still paying off the mountain of student loans she'd taken on in the hopeful days of community college, back when her mother's illness was just beginning. Now, between double shifts and late-night grocery runs, she managed her mother's prescriptions, appointments, and home care, never quite catching her breath. Rachel didn't complain. She never had. There was something quiet but fierce in the way she kept going, how she always made time for a kind word, a refill of coffee without being asked, or slipping an extra biscuit into a to-go bag when someone looked like they hadn't eaten all day. She was soft-spoken and often kept to herself, but her eyes carried a warmth that made even the most hardened regulars leave a little more whole than they'd arrived. She worked the closing shift most nights. And once the chairs were turned up on the tables and the register counted down, she would sit at the far-end booth with a bowl of staff meal, usually soup or leftover meatloaf, and take 10 quiet minutes for herself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. In a world that often gave her very little, Rachel still found ways to give. And that somehow made all the difference. It was the kind of night that sank into your bones. Rain lashed the windows in sheets, and the wind howled low and constant, like a sorrowful song that wouldn't stop. The diner was nearly empty, just a pair of truckers nursing coffee in silence and a lone man in the corner booth, hunched over his paper. Rachel had already begun the slow routine of closing. She'd wiped down the counters, stacked the ketchup bottles, and dimmed the overhead lights. It was nearly time for her favorite moment of the shift, the quiet 10 minutes when she could finally sit, kick off her shoes onto the booth, and eat whatever was left from the kitchen. Tonight it was a bowl of chicken soup, thick with carrots and noodles, and a heel of fresh bread. Not much, but warm, and in her world, that counted. She slid into the booth, fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic bowl, ready to let the steam chase away the cold that had crept into her hands. Then the door creaked open. A gust of wind rushed in first, followed by a figure so drenched it was hard to tell where the coat ended and the woman began. She stood just inside the entrance, shivering, dripping, eyes low and voice barely audible. Just a cup of hot water, please," she whispered, clutching her coat tighter. Rachel stood, soup untouched. She approached slowly, her heart already beating differently, not out of fear but concern. The woman looked to be in her 60s, maybe older. Her shoes were soaked through, her fingers red with cold. Rachel gently guided her to a seat near the radiator and fetched a clean towel from behind the counter. She didn't ask questions. She'd seen that look before. Hunger disguised as humility. Exhaustion masquerading as politeness. "I'll see what I can do," Rachel said softly. But the kitchen was already shut down. The last order had been plated an hour ago, the grill scrubbed and the fridge locked. All that remained was her own meal. The soup. The bread. She hesitated only a second. Then, without a word, she placed the bowl gently in front of the woman and added the bread on a napkin. "It's not much. But it's hot," Rachel offered, with the smallest of smiles. The woman's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She tried to refuse at first, shaking her head, whispering thanks, but Rachel just sat beside her and poured a cup of hot water from the kettle they used for tea. She even dropped in a slice of ginger and a touch of honey, just like she did for her mother when the coughing started up at night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, there was warmth, a kind of quiet kindness that didn't need to be explained or returned. When the woman finally took her first sip of soup, she closed her eyes. Rachel watched her closely, her own hunger forgotten. Sometimes, it wasn't about how much you had. It was about how much you were willing to give when no one was watching. And Rachel had just given everything she had. Little did she know, someone was watching. If this quiet act of kindness touched your heart the way it touched ours, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. We bring you real stories that remind us there's still good in this world. Stories of everyday heroes, silent sacrifices, and the moments that change everything. Because Rachel's story is just getting started. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching that night. Someone who would soon turn her simple gesture into something much bigger than she could ever imagine. Stay with us. The best is yet to come. Rachel didn't just stop at the soup. She moved with a quiet purpose, stepping into the small staff room in the back where she kept her things. Digging through the cubby beside her locker, she pulled out an old knitted scarf, faded maroon, with a loose thread hanging from one end. It had belonged to her mother years ago, worn soft from winters past. Rachel hesitated for a moment, running her fingers over the wool, then folded it neatly and carried it out. "Here," she said gently, offering it to the woman. "Just until you warm up." The woman stared at it, hands trembling. She took it as if it were something far too valuable for someone like her. Rachel didn't let the silence linger. She poured a cup of ginger tea, added a drizzle of honey, and placed it on the table beside the now empty soup bowl. The woman had eaten slowly, savoring each bite like it was a blessing. Rachel sat across from her, not as a waitress, not as someone offering charity, but simply as a fellow human being who saw the pain in another. The woman's eyes glistened, her lips parted like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Eventually, a hoarse whisper escaped. "I haven't had a hot meal in 3 days," she said. "And no one's looked at me like a person in longer than that." Rachel didn't reply with sympathy or clichés. She just nodded, hands wrapped around her own untouched tea, and listened. They spoke quietly for a few minutes, about the weather, about nothing really, and in those few minutes, Rachel offered the one thing most people denied to folks like her: dignity. Before the woman left, Rachel reached behind the counter once more and came back with a small paper bag. "I found some cookies left from this afternoon. Thought you might like them for later." The woman held the bag to her chest like it was a bouquet of roses. And when she finally stood to leave, scarf wrapped tightly around her shoulders, tea finished, and warmth creeping back into her fingers, she reached out and touched Rachel's hand. "You don't know what this means." "Thank you." Rachel smiled. "Take care, okay?" The door closed behind the woman with a soft chime of the bell, leaving the diner quiet once more. Rachel cleared the table, wiped down the surface, and tossed the used napkin into the trash. There was no applause, no audience. Just another long shift, just another act of kindness quietly done and quickly forgotten. But what Rachel didn't know was that someone had seen everything. In the far corner of the diner, behind the last booth where shadows pooled under the flickering light, the man from earlier sat still, coffee cold in his cup, newspaper untouched. He'd watched the whole exchange, every gesture, every word. His eyes followed Rachel as she returned behind the counter, her expression soft but tired, her back straight despite the long night. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather notebook. With a quiet sigh, he wrote something down, closed the book, and placed it back beside his wallet. Then quietly he stood, left a $20 bill on the table for the untouched coffee, and stepped out into the rain. Rachel never even saw him. But he saw her. And that would change everything. The man who had watched everything from the corner booth was not just any late-night customer. His name was David Langston. But no one in that diner would have guessed. He wore a simple wool coat, faded jeans, and a pair of scuffed leather shoes that had seen more rain than polish. His silver-streaked hair was still damp from the storm, and he'd ordered only a coffee when he slipped in quietly to escape the downpour. To the outside world, David Langston was a name whispered in corporate boardrooms and printed on Forbes covers. A billionaire. A tech visionary. A man with stakes in real estate, clean energy, and half a dozen startups that had changed the way people lived and worked. But tonight, he wasn't any of those things. Tonight, he was just a man, tired, driving home alone after a late board meeting downtown. He had taken a wrong turn, missed the highway ramp, and ended up on this forgotten side of Chicago where streetlights flickered and sidewalks cracked. The rain had started so suddenly and so hard that he'd pulled over at the first place he saw with lights on, an old diner with a neon sign buzzing half dead. He hadn't expected anything more than shelter from the storm. But what he witnessed in that quiet diner stirred something deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. As he sat in the booth, hidden behind his unread newspaper, he watched the young waitress give up her own meal without hesitation. He saw the gentleness in her hands as she wrapped a scarf around a stranger's shoulders. He heard the kindness in her voice, not rehearsed or performative, but honest and real. The way she made space for someone who had nothing, not for credit, not for praise, just because it was the right thing to do. And it wasn't lost on him. David had known hunger. He'd grown up in the rougher neighborhoods of Detroit, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs and still sometimes went to bed without dinner so her kids could eat. He remembered the feel of worn-out shoes, the embarrassment of using food stamps, the way people looked away when you asked for help. It had taken him decades to climb out of that life. Money had changed his world, but not his memory. And watching Rachel that night, so selfless, so instinctively good, was like seeing a reflection of what his mother had taught him all those years ago. That kindness, even the smallest kind, could be a lifeline. As the woman left the diner wrapped in Rachel's old scarf, David stayed a moment longer. He didn't move. Didn't speak. He just watched as Rachel quietly returned to her duties, clearing dishes, wiping tables, completely unaware of what her actions had meant. To most people, it was nothing. Just a waitress doing a decent thing on a stormy night. But to David, it was everything. He took out his small notebook, the one he always carried for thoughts and ideas. He wrote down a single line. Compassion is the rarest kind of wealth. Then he slipped the notebook back into his coat pocket, stood up, and left a crisp $20 bill on the table, far more than the coffee cost, but not nearly enough for what he'd just received. As he stepped out into the cold rain once more, David Langston knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just found shelter that night. He'd found purpose. And Rachel, she was about to find something too. The morning after the storm, the sun rose over Chicago with a kind of quiet gentleness, as if the sky itself was still recovering from the night before. The streets were damp, glistening with puddles, and the old neon sign outside the diner buzzed back to life, this time under a pale golden light. Rachel was already back at work. Same uniform, same tired shoes, same calm smile as she refilled sugar containers and set fresh menus at each table. To anyone passing by, it was just another slow morning at a forgotten diner on the edge of the city. But something felt different. She couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was the afterglow of having helped someone, or the quiet way the woman had squeezed her hand before leaving. Rachel hadn't told anyone about the encounter. She never did with things like that. What mattered was that someone got through the night a little warmer, a little less alone. At 10:47 a.m., the bell above the door jingled softly. She looked up from behind the counter and saw him, a man with silver hair and kind eyes, dressed in the same simple coat from the night before. He walked slowly, deliberately, and took a seat in the same booth he'd sat in just hours earlier. Rachel didn't recognize him. She'd been too focused on the woman to notice anyone else the night before. He smiled politely and ordered a black coffee and scrambled eggs, nothing fancy. She scribbled it down, tore off the ticket, and passed it to the cook window. When she brought his coffee, he looked up at her and spoke, not unkindly, but with quiet curiosity. "If that was your last meal last night, why did you give it away?" Rachel paused, surprised. She blinked, confused for a beat. "Sorry? You gave your dinner to that woman, didn't you?" There was no accusation in his voice. No judgment. Just a question from a man who had clearly seen more than she'd thought. Rachel set the coffee gently on the table and gave a small, almost bashful smile. "Yeah. I guess I did." He tilted his head, studying her. "Why?" She shrugged lightly, glancing toward the window, watching sunlight play against water-streaked glass. Then, after a moment, she answered. "Because sometimes, the ones who need help the most don't know how to ask for it." Her voice was soft, but certain. There was no pretense in it, no performance. Just a simple truth from someone who had lived enough to know it firsthand. David didn't reply immediately. He only nodded once, as if tucking her words into a quiet place inside him, where they'd stay. Rachel moved on to the next table, refilling a cup of decaf for a regular who always left exact change. She didn't notice the way David watched her, how his eyes followed her with a kind of respect that couldn't be bought, the kind reserved for people who lived their values without needing an audience. He finished his breakfast in silence, left a decent tip, and walked out without another word. Rachel thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. Something had already begun to shift, quietly, beneath the surface. And by the time she discovered what David had truly come back for, her life would never be the same. The lunch rush came and went, leaving behind the usual aftermath: crumbled napkins, clinking silverware, the murmur of dishes soaking in the back. Rachel moved through it all with her steady grace, the way she always did. No one rushed in this part of town. Life moved slow here, like honey in winter. It wasn't until nearly 2 p.m., as she cleared the last of the breakfast plates, that she noticed the folded note. It sat neatly tucked inside the empty coffee cup at the booth where the silver-haired man had sat. Nothing flashy, just a plain white envelope, barely larger than a postcard. Her brow furrowed as she picked it up. The cup was bone dry, like it had been placed there on purpose, like it was meant to be found. She glanced out the front window, half expecting to see the man walking away, but the sidewalk was empty. Just puddles and sunlight now. Rachel turned the envelope over. Her name was written on it, just Rachel, in neat, deliberate handwriting. Her stomach fluttered, unsure why. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a check. Her breath caught the second she saw the numbers. $75,000. She blinked, looked again, then staggered back a step, nearly knocking into the edge of the booth. For a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. This had to be a mistake. A joke, even. But then she saw the letter. It was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The same handwriting, simple and elegant. Rachel. I didn't come here looking for a meal. I came here to get out of the rain. But what I found was something far more nourishing. I watched you give the last of what you had to someone who had even less. Not for recognition. Not for praise. But because it was right. That kind of heart is rare. And it's worth investing in. This isn't payment for soup. This is faith in a person who sees the invisible and chooses kindness anyway. Do something bigger with it. DL. Rachel stood frozen in place, letter in hand, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Her eyes welled up before she even realized. She read the note again, slower this time, each word sinking deeper into her ribs. She thought of her mother's medical bills. The student loans that felt like a permanent shadow. The dream she'd shelved years ago of opening a place where no one would ever have to go hungry again. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and stunned. In her world, where kindness was often all she had to give, this letter felt like a hand reaching down into the deep and lifting her out. She clutched the envelope to her chest and looked around the empty diner, the cracked vinyl booths, the humming refrigerator, the clock that always ran 5 minutes fast. For the first time in a long while, she felt something shift. Hope. Real, terrifying, extraordinary hope. David Langston was gone. She might never see him again. But what he left behind was more than a check. It was a challenge. A doorway. A spark. And Rachel. She was about to light the fire. 6 months later, the diner was gone. Not the building, It still stood on the same quiet street, under the same flickering neon sign, but everything else had changed. The windows were cleaner now, glowing with warm yellow light that spilled onto the sidewalk like a welcome mat. The cracked vinyl booths had been replaced with handmade wooden tables, each one different but lovingly restored. The smell of fresh bread and simmering broth greeted every guest who walked through the door. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. The Last Meal Cafe. It was Rachel's dream, made real, not just a restaurant, but a haven. A place where no one had to explain their story to receive a hot meal. No questions asked. If you were hungry, you ate. If you were cold, someone found you a coat. And if all you needed was someone to sit with while you drank your tea, there was always a chair waiting. The community showed up in ways Rachel never expected. Local bakers donated day-old pastries. Farmers sent crates of produce at the end of the week. High school kids came in after class to sweep floors or wipe tables. Some days, a stranger would leave an envelope at the front counter. No name, just a few folded bills and a scribbled note. Keep going. Rachel paid off her student loans. She covered her mother's medical care, ensuring she had everything she needed to rest and heal in comfort. And with what remained, she poured her heart into the cafe, building something that would last. On one wall, just above a row of mismatched chairs, Rachel hung a hand-painted sign that had become the cafe's quiet anthem. When you have nothing left to give, give from the heart. People came in just to take photos of it. Others sat quietly beneath the words, reading them over and over like a prayer. One day, a local journalist stopped by for lunch, heard the story, and wrote a feature. Within days, the article went viral. Thousands of people shared it, moved by the idea that a single act of kindness could ripple out so far, could feed not just stomachs but souls. Donations poured in. Volunteers offered to build sister cafes in other cities. Letters arrived from across the country, from teachers, veterans, single moms, and teenagers, each one saying the same thing: thank you. We needed this. But Rachel never let it go to her head. She still swept the floors at closing time. She still took her break with a bowl of soup and 10 quiet minutes to herself. The only difference now was that, most nights, someone else was sitting at the far table, warming their hands around a cup of tea, just like that woman on the night it all began. Rachel didn't change the world overnight. She just opened her heart, and gave the world a place to sit down. And that made all the difference. In a world that often feels rushed and indifferent, Rachel's story reminds us of a powerful truth: you don't need wealth to make a difference. Sometimes the smallest acts, a warm meal, a kind word, a quiet gesture, can echo farther than we ever imagine. Especially for those of us who've lived long enough to see the highs and lows of life, we know, what lasts isn't what we keep, but what we give. Compassion doesn't fade with age, it deepens. And often, the quietest kindnesses become the loudest legacies. So if you've ever wondered whether your goodness still matters in a world that sometimes feels too busy to care, remember Rachel. She didn't wait for perfect conditions. She gave what she had, when it mattered most. And that changed everything. If stories like this speak to your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Justice Reloaded HD. We share true stories that restore faith in humanity, because it's never too late to believe in kindness again.